started. So a little bit about us. ACPA's Global Commission for the Development of oh my goodness, I can't even talk, listen to me. Commission for Global Dimensions of Student Development brings together ACPA's members from all functional areas interested in cross-cultural learning, development of intercultural competencies, internationalization, and student services around the world. The Commission also serves as home for international members, including ACPA's members living and working outside of the United States, as well as foreign-born ACPA members living and working in the United States. We would love for you all to stay connected with us as we move forward. And that's so important. I'm so sorry. So important that we be able to make those connections. So we have our email address and also our link tree. You can scan our QR code to get more information there. If you are attending and you've attended at least 3 of the 4 sessions that we've had, you do have the ability to attain our certificate for completion that we're doing for the colloquium this year. We do want to do a land acknowledgement related to ACPA's mission of supporting and fostering learning through the generations and sharing of knowledge and ACPA's strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. Our commission would like to acknowledge the indigenous land that each of us occupies today. Thus, we would like to invite everyone to acknowledge the ancestral homelands they are physically situated in today. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. Here at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, it is the Muskogee Creek people, and I would like to acknowledge their removal from this area. I would also ask our guest speakers today if they would like to acknowledge those in the areas where their institutions are, that they please feel free to do so. So we'd love to know who attended today, who's participating with us. So if you would just take a moment in the chat box to introduce yourself, your name, pronouns if applicable, where you're currently located, the names of the tribe where you're located, your position, and your institution. We would greatly appreciate that. So today we are going to be talking about some unique identities and how we navigate those identities. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page as how we are defining third culture and in-betweeners, I've put those definitions on the screen. Third culture individuals grew up in a culture different from the one in which his or their parents grew up. Their third cultural individuals often develop an identity that's rooted in people rather than places and spaces. For our in-betweeners, they are being defined as individuals who live at the edge of 2 national identities. Many times they find themselves belonging to and able to navigate multiple national identities and spaces, but not always wholly belonging to or fitting into one or the other. I want to add to this that though we are focusing on these 2 aspects of identity, there's also a lot of intersectionality and other identities that cross into this. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that as well. Today we have 4 amazing speakers, and I'm really excited to have them here. Dominique Hector, who's from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I am at. We're excited to have him. He is a student here, a PhD student. We also have Kothra Gaber. She is with us from Vanderbilt. So excited to have her as well. Ashley, who is visiting with us from as a representative of NASPA, and then Hugo Garcia, who is a faculty at Texas Tech University. So what we're going to do is give each one of our speakers about 10 minutes to talk a little bit about their identities. We gave them 4 questions to look at based on their identities. And so they're going to be responding as they speak to these 4 questions. At the end, we'll give you all a moment to ask some questions as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Dominique first and allow him to take the screen.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Dominique Hector. I am originally from Fairhope, Alabama. That is close to Mobile, Alabama, if you all have ever heard of Mobile. Um, a part of my identity, I would identify as an in-betweener or an individual who is experiencing third culture as well. My father and my grandfather are both from Haiti. My grandfather immigrated here to the United States in the 1940s. And while immigrating here, he experienced a lot of challenges that he has talked to me about throughout my childhood and adulthood. And some of the things that I've been able to learn from him is just how important intersectionality is when we're talking about the presence of these different identities. Um, Building on that, I would like to also encompass my father because I do not speak the native language of Creole, but it was something that was spoken in my grandparents' home. And so I had the privilege of hearing it quite a bit, but I've never had the opportunity to go back to our homeland to visit. And so that's one of the things I'm hoping to do after graduation. When it comes to the questions that we were given by Dr. Bass, I believe one of the first ones was talking about our unique experience based on our identity. And I would say that navigating as an in-betweener has been a very liberating experience. And what I mean by that is that the intersectionality that we see associated with it oftentimes allows us to talk about identities that are left in the margins. And what I have learned through my higher education experience is that we don't really get to hear too many times about the progressive things that are happening in some of these cultures. And so myself personally, I do identify as a gay man as well. And that is one of the things that has not been unpacked enough, in my opinion, when it comes to Haitian culture. And so moving forward and doing the doctoral research around this, I have learned that it is very important to make sure that we are talking about how all of our identities are being encompassed. And one of the things that I most appreciate from Dr. Bass is really sitting down and having these conversations about how we show up in space in real time. And I believe that that is one of the things that has helped me be able to navigate this role and show up in spaces that may not see individuals like myself. And so I also want to talk a little bit about how my educational experience has developed and how it's evolved as well. Beginning in undergrad, I started college back in 2010, and I was the first man from our family who attended a higher education institution. And at that time, I received a lot of backlash from family members because their idea of being a traditional Black or Haitian man meant that you needed to go to work immediately. You didn't have time to sit around and theorize and talk about how the world should be. You need to deal with the reality of the world at hand. And so while I was doing my undergraduate studies, I became very interested in health disparities because I noticed a lot of differences that were happening in between cultures. And I wanted the opportunity to be able to see how intersectionality played a part in that, but also how we can really unpack this idea to get down to the root of what we call a in-betweener. And what I found out is that there are a lot of misconceptions as well that we think about when we talk about African American or Haitian Americans' health. And I learned that there was a large emphasis on talking about things like hypertension and physical diet, but there wasn't a lot that was around mental health and social emotional support. And so learning those things in undergrad really helped me be able to have conversations with my father and with my grandfather about how do we progress as men in our family and how do we take care of the men that are in our families. And from that perspective, I remember my grandfather telling me that you're doing work that no one in our family has ever took a chance on or sat down to really think about. And I think that this is something that you should share with many people. And so with that, I decided that I wanted to further my education around health disparities, but I also wanted to open up access to folks that looked like me and people who may have come from places like me. And so I decided to enroll in a master's program, and I received a master's in public health. And through that, my emphasis area was health education and promotion. And I moved to Hattiesburg, Mississippi at the time. It was a very, very liberal place in Mississippi. So when most people think of Mississippi, they think of very conservative nature. But while in Hattiesburg, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of individuals who were very profound and very innovative. And through that experience, we were able to talk about how cultures show up in different states and different places. And me growing up in Alabama, I really thought that I was going to see some of the same things in Mississippi once I got there, because traditionally that's what we say in the South, is that whatever happens in Alabama happens right next door in Mississippi. But when I got to Mississippi, I saw that there were a whole host of things that were different. There were different conversations that were happening. And I realized that I had bought into the misconceptions around what was happening in Mississippi. And while I was there, this is where I learned and had the opportunity to see people of color really doing healthcare and health disparity work. And that was mind-blowing for me, because I was always told that you would never find something of that value in Mississippi. And so while there, it really helped me understand more the idea of intersectionality. And I know I keep coming back to that term, but this has been an ever-evolving process for me in trying to figure out what that term means uniquely and authentically to me. And while doing my work there, I had the opportunity to meet with a professor by the name of Dr. Anderson Lewis, Jakara Anderson Lewis. And she was doing some work around electronic health and digital health in Black and Brown communities. I thought that this was very interesting, but I noticed an issue that we saw when we started doing the research. And it was that a lot of folks that resided in Mississippi, especially in the Mississippi Delta, did not have access to the internet or Wi-Fi access. And so with those things, we were seeing that a lot of those individuals did not have the proper access to health information. And what we were seeing was that health literacy was going down in those communities. And so one of the recommendations that we came up with was making sure that we placed a peer educator from each community into the Mississippi Delta. And that required us to do what is called community-based participatory research. So we had to meet with gatekeepers and we had to meet with other individuals who were there. But I also found that there was a whole community of international folks who lived in the Delta as well. And those voices oftentimes were misrepresented or they weren't included at all. And so during this research project, we were able to bring multiple voices to the table. And that was one of the first times that I was able to learn how the Americanized or the Western way of how we do research, how it could seem detrimental to communities who are not used to doing that kind of rigorous conversation. And so moving forward, when we started doing the discussion piece of our work, I really had what I like to call a light bulb moment, or a come to Jesus moment, as we say here in the South. And I realized that the work had to further evolve in order for us to make sure that we were being inclusive and that we were encompassing everyone. And then it made me think about my home state of Alabama. After finishing my master's in public health, I had every intention of moving to Florida. That's where I was going next. And the reason I wanted to do so is because Florida has a very large Haitian population. And so I wanted to immerse myself in that so that I could further learn about folks who come from Haiti and folks who may share similar experiences. And there was a professor, another professor by the name of Dr. Laura Forbes, who was here at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and she said, I understand that you would like to go to Florida, but I really think that you should take a chance on us here at UAB. Come see what we have to offer, and maybe if you like what you see, this may be a home for you where we can explore multiple different things. I took that chance 5 years ago, and I'm still here at the University of Alabama today. And one of the things that I've learned the most while being here at UAB during my PhD studies is that health disparities and the identities that encompass it are ever evolving, and we will never reach an end goal. It's going to constantly take new forms. And so we have to make sure that we are able and ready to respond when that happens. The last thing that I would like to say about my identity, and I think the most important piece, is now I'm looking at gender identity and sexual orientation as well. And I'm noticing that within intersectionality, that those pieces are oftentimes left out of the in-betweener and the third culture conversation. And it could be because of how our cultures are set up traditionally, but I don't think that that prevents us from further progressing. And so I'm hoping to hear from the other panelists as well on some of the things that they have noticed in their experiences. But I think for my own unique experience, I'm just grateful to be able to be a part of this community and be a part of the in-betweener and third culture community, because I'm learning every day. And I'm just so thankful to be a part of these opportunities and these situations. I don't have anything else to share, Dr. Bass. So if you have a question, I could answer a question.
I think we'll wait and do questions at the end with everyone, but everyone be thinking about what questions you might have for Dominique. So our next guest speaker is Kothra Gaber, and she's at Vanderbilt University, and I'm going to give her the mic. Go ahead, Kothra.
Good morning or afternoon. Sorry I sound like this. Allergies are in high gear in Nashville, so this is a new experience for me. But for those of you that I haven't had the privilege to meet, my name is Kothra Gaber. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So when I was asked to speak, I literally spent so much time contemplating on like what I wanted to share. And so just to give you some background context, I would say that I identify as an in-betweener and third culture. I'm a first-gen American. My parents are immigrants. My mom is Egyptian, and my Baba, which is my dad, he's Libyan. And so I think when I was thinking about challenges that I dealt with, I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, beautiful place. If you haven't gone to Mississippi, def go. But because of that, and because of like generationally where I am, I'm of the generation that remembers the before and after of 9/11. And I don't think when I was reflecting on my story that I could do it justice if I didn't acknowledge that my most salient identity as an openly identifying Muslim female has definitely impacted my collegiate experience. So I think growing up, like I had always struggled with finding my place because at home I have one culture, right? My parents are Arabs, they're kind of traditional. We're super close knit. We have different set of values and expectations. But then when I leave, right, I have a whole different set of cultural expectations and experiences. And I think I struggled for the longest of time trying to find a balance, especially as it relates to my hijabi experience. So when I entered into my undergrad experience, I was under the impression that everybody was going to be educated and I wouldn't have to struggle as much. I wouldn't have to fight so hard to create spaces for me that were comfortable and felt safe. And I realized my freshman year pretty early on that that wasn't necessarily the case. And one of the most transformative experiences during my freshman year that kind of helped set the tone of the trajectory that I would go forward with. My institution would put up 9/11 memorials in several of the buildings. And I think that's beautiful. And I think that's a way to acknowledge the hurt and the harm that's been created. But I would have students, I would chill in the like lounge, but I would have students or visitors randomly come up to me and say that I was responsible or my people were responsible for the hurt and harm that had been created. And I learned pretty early on that those buildings around that time was not safe, right? Or it was just really uncomfortable to fully engage with. And so from my freshman year, I knew that like the month of September, those were buildings to avoid. And there were no counter narratives. There were no opportunities for counter narratives. So it was me just navigating my collegiate experience like my normal peer, but I didn't have that space to report it. I didn't know what resources exist, especially because growing up in Mississippi, a lot of the DEI talks, diversity, equity, inclusion talks, are just spaces where predominantly discussing the Black and white experience, which is beautiful and it's fine. But when you don't necessarily fit within the racial boxes that were created, it's like, where do you go? Even with having a multicultural center on campus. And then just having to navigate other religious limitations, right? Having to fight for getting off for religious holidays was super frustrating. I specifically remember a lab professor saying that I wasn't allowed to skip for a holiday that I was more than happy to make up. Just the day of, I needed to be able to celebrate with my family and my friends. Or just being able to walk across campus and not being called a slur or problematic term like towelhead or terrorist or murderer. And just like when those events happen, where do I go, right? Especially because I wasn't necessarily comfortable with going to the diversity center. And so I realized that if there weren't going to be spaces for people to advocate for me and like others like me, that I would create those spaces. I was really fortunate enough to have a support system in terms of a mentor. And she was phenomenal in helping me start like an interfaith group, right? So these were opportunities for me to connect with other spiritually different or non-spiritual individuals who didn't necessarily have a space on campus. But let's talk about what our faiths mean. Let's talk about our experiences on campus. Let's create those opportunities for collaboration and communication and just community, right? Because at the end of the day, I think all students want to feel like they belong. And it turned out to be a really good experience. I learned so much about other faiths that I had not really delved into. I learned about campus resources. I learned about community resources that existed. And I think having those opportunities helped create an opportunity for me to share my experiences. And I felt heard for the first time in forever, right? And so with that, I was able to like extend that experience into talking into intro to sociology classes or psychology classes, or even intro to religion classes on campus. And that to me was a really transformative experience. The feedback that I got from other students was like, I was consistently told like nobody realized like these things were happening on campus. Like, how like you are amazing for navigating these issues. Like how can we best support similar identities to yours or like similar or different religious individuals, especially because it's in the Bible Belt and it's a predominantly Christian space. And I think that helped set the personal philosophy that I practice as a practitioner. My undergrad was actually in biochem, which is really funny to me that I think about it. But I think because of those experiences, although really challenging, I was able to utilize and hone the privilege of my positionality as an in-betweener in a third culture into something that's positive for myself, but for other people like me. And so when I think about the advantages, while I'm still trying to figure out where a home is, quote unquote, and my niche within my communities, depending on where I am, I think it's being a third culture and an in-betweener provides so many privileges, right? I get to stick my foot in both cultures, but I don't necessarily belong to either. And so I'm able to take the good and the bad, right? So I can acknowledge and like embrace my Arab side, my Muslim side, while critiquing it, right, for misogyny, sexism, or racism that may exist, and simultaneously do that for my American side, right? And I don't think a lot of people are positioned in a way to do that, where they're allowed to reflect, to truly understand, and then identify the gaps that exist and think of action steps to further support students who hold those identities. One of the key memories during my graduate experience was I had one of my other mentors inform me that there is so much beauty in my positionality being like a biracial North African American because it provides fluidity, right? I neither belong, but I can also accept both and embrace both. And prior to that conversation, I don't think I looked at it that way. I thought it was just a struggle because I never had a home. And I didn't necessarily feel like I was truly connected to my institution because I felt like I was always advocating for myself. And there was never a person or a office that I could like feel comfortable lounging in or just creating opportunities for these conversations. And so when she said that, I think it was an aha moment for me. And I was super, super, super grateful for that challenging perspective because I've been able to embrace that in my philosophy as a practitioner, right? So while there's challenge and it is hard and it is stressful at times, there is beauty in being able to be a third part of a third culture or an in-betweener that a lot of people don't have. And so I, again, have been able to utilize those experiences and transform that into privilege. So in the work that I currently do, I add in other identity gaps and I add in conversations related to religious diversity because that's an identity that I hold. But what other ways do we not think about different identities? How can we extend that beyond the racial and ethnicity conversations that already exist? What about LGBT+? What about sexuality? What about socioeconomic status? And being able to do that in the work that I do now has been really, really transformative. And it's been really, really wonderful being able to do that as a professional, have that space as a professional. I think one of the key things that I've learned, especially as a woman of color, and then I'll wrap up, is that through my experiences, I've learned that I don't always have to be the sole representation of experiences with whether that's third culture, in between, or Muslim, female, that it's okay to step back, but still add to the conversation, but I don't have to be the sole representation because burnout is real. And I think we've all experienced it at some point in our professional experience. And so what does that look like when it means finding a healthy balance for our experience? And so especially with the pandemic, I've been able to find a balance of things that bring me joy professionally and things that bring me joy personally. And it's been a practice that I continue to focus on throughout my professional experience, hopefully as we transition out of the panorama, fingers crossed. So with that, I will wrap up, but thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my experience. And I'm so excited to hear from the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Kothra. So Ashley Young is our next panelist. Ashley, I'll give you the floor.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Ashley Christina Young. The K is that's what it stands for. And I'll share that because that's my dad's last name. It was Christina, but he Americanized it from being Czech from Kochina to Christina. So I share that because I have a unique, my background is I am an Asian American adoptee. So I was adopted when I was 4 months old from South Korea. And I grew up in very rural, small town, Nebraska. My hometown, if you want to look it up, is called Platte Center, Nebraska. And there are about 300 people total. And so I say this quite often that one of my biggest culture shocks was moving into the residence hall at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, when I was a freshman, and realizing that there were more people in my building than there were in my entire hometown. The other, I think, unique position that I had in growing up was that both of my parents are from this really small town. And so we joke, but everyone is related to everyone. And so even now when I get invited to different events, weddings, other things, my husband is often like, how is this person related to you? I'm like, oh, well, they're like basically a second cousin, but they're kind of like, we consider them a first cousin, like there's all of these different layers that come with that identity of growing up in a small town. And so one of the challenges that I think I experienced in higher education was when I went to the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, which is a largely, predominantly white institution. That was really the first time that I was confronted with what it meant to be Asian American. Because having grown up in such a small environment, having 69 kids in my class, there wasn't, I don't think I necessarily experienced in reflection as much outward racism toward me because of the positioning of my family within this community. And so I think the other unique part of my upbringing, like I said, is that I was in this really small town environment. And so when I thought about who I was and my history, my culture, my favorite thing to have on birthdays when I was younger was kolaches, because that's a common Czech dish, a dessert. And so even when I do things like having a cultural potluck at one of my previous institutions, and we were all asked to bring something or a piece of food that belongs closely with our culture, and I would bring something like that, my students would often look at me very very curiously, because that was not expected. I joke that I am a bad Asian because I don't like super spicy foods. I can't do it. And my students would bring me things like papaya salad, and I couldn't handle it. And so I'm learning now. I'm getting better in terms of adapting to that. But all jokes aside, I think that was a really that was some of the challenges that I experienced growing up being in this space. My mom would really try, my mom and dad. But I was adopted in the in the 80s, early 90s, and there just wasn't as much awareness that you had to provide your transracial adoptee children these experiences to connect with their culture. Because as much as my mom tried, at the end of the day, she was a white woman trying to teach me about Korea, a place that she had never been, a place that she had never experienced, and didn't know a lot about that culture. And so I think as I got older and was in college, throughout college in my 20s, that's really when I started to explore what it meant for me to be an Asian American. And I think in being in higher education, so up until recently, I worked at higher education institutions, and there are not a lot of Asian Americans working in student affairs. And so I also had to really reflect on what did that mean for me in my position, in terms of what did students see. I always took it very seriously that I was representing something to these students, because I'm a first generation college student as well. And I often tell people that the only folks I knew growing up in my small town who had college degrees were my teachers. And so I didn't really know what was possible for me as a career. I don't think any of us in this space thought, I want to grow up and work at a college or university. That's not typically the thing, right? And so I always take it very seriously in what was seen, how I was seen at my institutions, because I knew that for some of our students, especially our Asian American students, I might be the only Asian American staff member that they interact with the entire time that they're at the institution. And if they have a desire or a dream to go into higher education, that maybe just in seeing me in that role first, that gave them the confidence that they could do it too. So part of my also, I think I'll share a little bit about my background in terms of my education. So like I said, I attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as for undergraduate, my undergraduate degree. And then I moved to St. Louis for my master's degree in higher education administration. And that was also really illuminating to me, because that was really the first time that I had moved to a major metropolitan area. I think other members of the panel have referenced that as well, but just getting to understand I think cultural experiences beyond just my own lens was really important. And I got to see that in living in St. Louis, and specifically because the institution that I was at, which was the University of Missouri St. Louis, has a large commuter population, really close ties to the community colleges there, and a lot of military would go to UMSL. And so it was very strange being, a 22-year-old and advising student organizations that the student organization leader was in their 40s. And so I think getting a chance to see that too was very life-changing for me, and something that has influenced my career as I moved forward. So as I mentioned, I was previously at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I worked with the Thompson Scholars, which is a program for students who are recipients of the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation Scholarship. And it is a very diverse learning community. The university overall has about 18% minorities, and the Thompson Scholars is closer to about 70% in terms of the first generation population, and about 30, I think it's around 40% currently for minorities. And so just a much more diverse population of students. To maintain their Buffett scholarships, students have to participate in the first 2 years of this program. And so working in that program was probably one of the the biggest professional growth opportunities that I had ever had, because it was really a chance to see in action how students were navigating these in-between cultures, right? Working in the Thompson Scholars Program really has influenced my dissertation work, what I want to research, because I was in charge of our leadership training. And it was very clear to me that what we were taught, right, is as the American way of leadership, and what is valued in American leadership didn't always translate to maybe the cultural communities of origin of the students that I was working with and training. You know, I told Dr. Bass an example of a student who I was really close with. She's an Afghan female and wanted to do community outreach work within the Afghan community after graduating. And was what I was teaching her in intrusivizing techniques and in how to, you know, make change or bring about changes with her group of mentees, because that's what we, you know, has always been told to me as the right way to do it, the American way to do it, was that going to be effective for her moving into her cultural communities of origin. And so that has really influenced what I am studying and what my passion in terms of leadership education. I now currently work at NASPA for the Center for First Generation Student Success. And I share that because NASPA is headquartered in Washington, DC, and my family has decided to make the move out to the DC area. And so I wanted to share this as a story because it was really impactful to me. We took our son, and he's Hapa, you know, he's half Korean and he's half white. And we took him to one of the really popular Korean grocery stores in the DC area called H Mart. And we were sitting in H Mart, we were getting some food and we were hanging out. And my son turned to look at me and said, "Mom, I love this place. I feel so at home here." And he's 8 years old. And that really hit me hard in terms of my mom heart, because that was something I never experienced growing up. I never experienced seeing other Koreans and being around other Koreans and hearing firsthand Korean experiences. And that was really one of the reasons we settled where we did. We're in Fairfax County, which has the third highest population of Koreans in the United States, and have been actively looking at getting our son into, you know, Korean led Taekwondo classes, because he's in Taekwondo now, but his Taekwondo master is not Korean, and just giving him a chance to connect with that part of him. That is huge to me, because that's something, like I said, I didn't get to experience growing up, and I want him to be proud of being Korean and really be proud of who he is. And so that's me. That's my in-between culture. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much for sharing with us. I really appreciate that. So our final panelist is Hugo Garcia. He's at Texas Tech University. And Hugo, I will give you the mic.
Buenos días. Saludos desde Las Vegas, Nevada, aquí donde yo vivo. Yo me llamo Hugo Alberto García González. Yo soy profesor de Educación Superior en la Universidad Tecnológica de Texas. Yo nací en Tijuana, Baja California, México, y fui criado en la ciudad de San Diego, California, aquí en los Estados Unidos. Hello, good morning, everyone. Greetings from Las Vegas, Nevada, which is where I reside, where I live. And I'm a professor of higher education at Texas Tech University. And so in discussing my particular trajectory, because I want to be very mindful of time, one of the most important things about having sessions such as this is the Q&A and doing some follow-ups, because there are some very fascinating stories. So I'm going to keep mine very brief. You know, one of the challenges of immigrating to another country is, a scholar once said, once you leave your home, you have no home. So I was born in Tijuana, Baja California, Mexico, where my parents moved to. And the challenges of Tijuana at that time was it was a very small tourist-based town dependent on tourism from San Diego, particularly from the military. San Diego has a very large military base. And so during Prohibition, for those who are, aware of some of the challenges that Prohibition, the law, challenged a lot of folks who wanted to consume alcohol. Many of them went down to Cuba to drink, for those in this part of the United States, or that part of the United States. Others here in California would come down and drive down to San Diego and cross the border to Tijuana. And so that's why we have the tourist industry that we have down there, but it also created a lot of poverty. A lot of folks who moved to Tijuana to work in some of this tourism, dealing with consumption of alcohol and gambling and so forth that was illegal in the United States. And so my parents met in Tijuana, and my father grew up next to the Tijuana River, and in a community called Cartolandia. Carton is like those boxes that you do shipping, right? Like Amazon and FedEx or whatever, carton boxes. My dad lived in a carton box community where his home was carton boxes. And so my dad was one of those kids who would sell chicles and newspapers on the streets of Tijuana. And so when my father met my mother, they immigrated to the United States when I was 5 years old. And so one of the things that many parents want when they immigrate to the United States is a better education. My father has no education. My mother had a 6th grade education. So when we came to San Diego, whatever the school says must be what's in the best interest of my child. So I didn't speak English. I remember when I used to speak in kindergarten and in 1st grade, my teachers would snicker. My classmates would snicker because I didn't know English. And so I would try, and I got to a point where I was so embarrassed to speak English, and to a point where I was held back in kindergarten, for not knowing enough English. And so when my parents met with my teachers in kindergarten, so that your son Hugo doesn't know enough English, we're going to retain him for another year. He's going to have to repeat kindergarten. And so my trajectory there, I went to 6 different elementaries, 3 different junior highs, 3 different high schools. I got sent out to a continuation school to get my GED. My high school GPA was a 1.48, 1.47 high school GPA. Yet here I am with a PhD, having a conversation about navigating higher education. And so the challenge in terms of trying to answer some of the questions that have been posed for us panelists is, what are some of the challenges you experience in education based on your identity? Well, my identity is one where I identify as a neither or. That's my identity. In Mexico, there's the same. For Mexican Americans, or those who are raised in the United States, in that if they were born in Mexico and immigrate to the United States, the saying is, no eres de aquí ni de allá. No eres de aquí ni de allá. You're not from here nor from there. Because the Mexican community in Mexico will see you as, well, you're not really Mexican because you were raised over there. But the Americans will always say you're not really American because you're born over there, you're immigrated here, and you will never be seen as an American, no matter how refined the English, no matter how well dressed, no matter how high your educational attainment, that you will never be seen as a true American, like this idea as a forever foreigner. And so to me, that's my identity. No soy de aquí ni de allá. I'm a neither or. And so I'm a permanent resident of this country. So this idea of much of the corpus of research when it comes to higher education research, the unit of analysis is to be students for obvious reasons, right? We want to examine what are the factors that promote or impede student success. So it makes sense. But then when you disaggregate the student populations, they're mostly domestic students, Asian American, African American, Latinos who were born and raised here, right? The experiences of marginalized communities within the context of the United States. Very little research explores the educational outcomes or experiences of international students within the United States. When we do look at students who are immigrate to the United States and are not US citizens, the experiences of undocumented students. So like DACA students, there's a large corpus of research on DACA students. But you tell me, how many research have you seen that explores the student experiences who are permanent residents? Because we're not US citizens. And we're not living in our country of origin. So we're not considered really citizens of there because we haven't lived there since we were kids. Yet our documents and paperwork are here and we're considered domestic, but we're also considered international. And in the eyes of the United States, we're resident aliens, right? And so this idea of, you know, where do I fit in? There are more research in terms of the experiences of domestic students, again, like I said, international students on F1 or other student visas, or DACA students, but there's hardly anything on my experiences as a permanent resident. And so looking at some of the things posed, you know, what are the challenges based on my identity as an either or? Well, there are jobs I can't get. There are federal laws. There are federal jobs, there are state jobs, there are county jobs, city jobs. I cannot get because I'm not a US citizen. You have to be a US citizen. And I know there are some students who are international students and they're told, hey, there's a job fair, you're looking for a job, why don't you go over here? There's going to be a job fair and you should, go over there and see if you can talk to some folks over there. They get on the bus, they work their way over there, they spend all this time to get ready, prepare themselves, get all dressed up, work their way across town, and then they're so, are you a US citizen? And they're like, no. Oh, well, then you can't apply. You're ineligible. That happens to me too, right? If it's a US only position, I cannot apply for it. What are some of my advantages? Well, I'm a permanent resident, so I can get jobs as long as it's not required that you are a US citizen. That's why I'm a tenured faculty member at Texas Tech University, right? So there are disadvantages and advantages in terms of how I've been able to navigate higher education. But the other thing is this, again, navigating is, I was an international relations major at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD. And one of the things that every IR major is recommended, not required, but highly suggested, is that you have a study abroad experience, right? How can you talk about international relations and major in that without having a real international exposure? Well, I'm a permanent resident. If after 6 months and 1 day, I go over outside of the United States, I can get deported. And if you've been deported, as many of you know, I'm not eligible to ever come back to the United States for at least 10 years. And that's just to apply to come back here. So there were a lot of things that I did not do as a student because I'd be in violation of my permanent residency. And so understanding what are some of the challenges that folks experiences as residents, that still international in scope. So when I come back to the United States, I always there's a line for US citizens and a line for everybody else. So my wife and kids, they go on the US citizen side. I have to go over here and I tell my wife and kids, you guys just go away from me to this side. I'll be there like in an hour. So I know I want to leave time for questions for Q&A. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Hugo. I'd like to open it up for our audience. Does anyone in our audience have a question? If you do, please unmute and ask your question. for any of our panelists. You're also welcome to type it in the chat. Well, I have oh, here we go. Natalie Cruz says, thank you to everyone for their impactful and individual stories. This is a great experience to hear these stories. Thank you for sharing. I'll put a question out for you all to get us started. So what advice would you give to an individual who identifies as a third culture or in-betweener working or studying in higher ed? And this can be for any of our panelists.
I can say my advice that I would give is not to be scared of your voice, because your voice matters. And even though sometimes, you know, you don't want to be on another search committee again and again and again, your voice being in that place is valued, and your perspective is needed and heard, especially I think when we're talking about, like I said, predominantly white institutions that you know, higher education in general historically has not been for people who look like many of us on this panel, right? It was not created for us. And so, like I said, please be confident in who you are, be confident in what your voice brings, what your perspective brings, and don't be afraid to share it.
Did anyone else want to address that question?
No, Dominique, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dominique. I'd rather hear from you.
I just want to piggyback off of what Ashley said about not being afraid to use your voice. And I think with that, it's also vitally important to make sure that you are not afraid to take up space, because taking up space is another reclamation as to why we are now in these spaces. And if we refuse to pull up our chair to the table, then we need to bring a folding chair or build a new table. But we don't have the option any longer to further not utilize our voice or take up the space. So I just wanted to reiterate that from Ashley.
Hugo, did you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to say, you know, again, the importance of embracing your identity, embracing who you are, and using that to empower yourself and others in the same boat, for a lack of a better term, right? And so for me, you know, I love, in a sense, my identity, and you know, I identify as mestizo, right? You know, when people ask me about your race, you're Latino, I say, nah, I'm a mestizo. You know, and in terms of my nationality, as a Mexican, and I reside in the United States, but in terms of my mestizo-ness and how I bring in these multiple identities that are fluid, right? And it's important to understand that in certain contexts, some identities are more salient than others, and embracing them, and also empowering others to embrace their identities, right? And those of us who work in student affairs, and those of us who work with students, understanding what the you know, being and residing and working in the United States of what it means for us, like who are permanent residents or international students, what it means to be in compliance. Because a lot of times I've talked to international students and said some of the advice that I received from either faculty or those in student affairs gave me advice that would put me in compliance and violation of my student visa, or even for resident aliens, right? And I hate using the word resident aliens, but that's the term the US government uses. So you know, I'm a guest in your country. So you know, that what does that mean? That, you know, if I jaywalk, can I get deported? If I get speeding tickets, can I get deported? What are the challenges that institutions and institutional agents who provide information can get them in violation of remaining here in the United States? Be mindful of that.
There's a question in the box from Renee Bowling. She says, to what extent have you found multiracial, multicultural, international, or multidimensional identity models helpful?
So I have lots of thoughts, probably super unpopular. I think throughout my graduate experience, something that I really struggled is the use of models, just in general, regardless of what theory it is. I think for me, I find them helpful, right, as a basis guideline, but a lot of them try to assess emotional like connection, emotional being, belonging. And I think it's really hard to articulate it in a way that makes sense in a real world experience, right? And so I think like for me, I found it helpful to use as a base guideline, but a lot of it's just not really helpful for the way that like students experience their collegiate like or academic experiences. And so I also find it really kind of problematic that a lot of them are outdated. Um, they were made for specific populations that no longer exist based on the current demographic of student populations. So until we get those updated or until we get new ones made or new models made, I don't think they accurately represent like what we do in the field and our students currently. And don't get me wrong, I also want to acknowledge that the student population shifts every single year. But like, if we're looking at models that were made like 10, 15 years ago, or even like 30, right? Who? Because our students don't look like that and they don't have the same experiences. So it's something that I take very loosely, and I think it's helpful, right? The processes that students go through, especially our multiracial students or international students, but I don't think that there's a lot of literature on, again, the intersecting identities that exist outside of like race, ethnicity. So I think there's a lot of room to be had for new models to be existing. And I think it's really impactful that we have such a wonderful well-rounded panel like this, because I know and I'm hearing that wonderful work is being done. And I know that everybody in the Zoom room is doing their own individual work to contribute to higher education. So it's only just a matter of time of when things get published and when things get recognized, which is kind of problematic to say, but recognized in a way where we can frequently use them in the work that we do today.
Thank you so much, Kothra. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. I want to share my screen just one more time and give you all some information here about our commission. We really, really appreciate you all for attending today. We would love for you to become more involved, to get to know just a little bit more about the work that we do. We also have some positions open within our commission right now. So if you're interested in that, please reach out, let us know. We've got some postings out on social media, but we have more information through our Linktree address on here. If you're interested, scan, learn a little bit about us, come and join us. If you'd like to take a position on the panel, we would love to have you to apply for that. So I want to thank all of our panelists for today, for coming and for sharing who they are with everyone here, and also taking the questions that we had here at the end. I really appreciate all of you. This research is dear to my heart as an in-betweener myself, so I appreciate the work that you all are doing in higher ed and that you're sharing your voices. And that will conclude us for today. Thank you so much to everyone who attended today. If you haven't already, please make sure that you've given us your information in the chat so we will have that.